Your next lecture, and again, this does not have associated questions that go with it. We haven't gotten to any of those practice questions yet, but still, this is valuable information that you really need to know to kind of set the stage for why the Western Hemisphere develops the way it does after European colonization. So you have, first of all, a history pre-European colonization that is starting with tens of thousands of years ago, people settling North and South America, and this is often referred to as a land bridge between what is today Russia and Alaska. This is not true. Back then, that would have actually been more glacial ice. In the children's movies Ice Age, a lot of it is more accurately depicted there because of the glacial ice that ancient cavemen, I guess you could call them, were moving about on. So it's not a super accurately portrayed time in history, but nonetheless, you first have to have the settling of the Americas. When I used to teach global history, human history is often referred to as East African origins because it is in what is modern Ethiopia in Africa where the oldest human ancestors are discovered, and then from there you have a settling of the globe. So anyway, you first have the settling of the Americas tens of thousands of years ago, and just before European colonization, you have very advanced civilizations that are also not very accurately depicted in history, certainly not in pop culture, Hollywood films, for example. So it is often a situation that is portrayed as backward people learning from advanced Europeans. And while there were certainly some new technologies, such as firearms, etc., that were introduced to the New World, as it is historically referred to, by Europeans, there's quite a bit that is being taught to Europeans by their indigenous counterparts in the New World. And some of the things that they're learning show that in some ways the indigenous population was actually more advanced than and superior to the Europeans. So I will refer back to this. But what are some of these advanced civilizations? So Western natives are most accurately depicted in the film Dances with Wolves, but that is after the establishment of the United States. But the lifestyle, nonetheless, is how Great Plains nomadic indigenous tribes lived. You also have the mound builders of the Mississippi Valley. This is probably the least notable in history, but yet very impressive. So the mounds in the Mississippi Valley manipulated the land for better control over agriculture. So what that means is when there was flooding, these mounds were often keeping crops from being destroyed by that flooding. Also taking advantage, much like ancient river valley civilizations, of the fertilization that flooding would bring. The civilization also had very extensive trade networks stretching from modern-day Minnesota, Indiana, Ohio, so parts of the Great Plains and Midwest, all the way to their location in what is today modern Louisiana and the Port of New Orleans. This is really, really impressive, particularly because these mounds that are massive, entire villages would be fed by the food that was produced on these mounds. So that should tell you how massive they are. Farm field size mounds were being constructed by hand. This is obviously long prior to modern equipment. That would be a daunting task today with modern diesel machinery, and yet it was being done by hand prior to European contact in the New World. That is extremely impressive and probably one of the least talked about advancements in indigenous history. You also have South American civilizations that are often viewed as very, very separate and different than what we think of as indigenous or Native American. When these advanced civilizations in South America are living their advanced lifestyles at the same exact time as these Great Plains tribes or Mississippi Valley mound builders. So these are all Western Hemisphere indigenous populations, and oftentimes they are viewed as extremely different, and that is not necessarily the case until after European colonization. So anyway, you have the Aztec Empire, which people are often familiar with from global history in 9th and 10th grade, if not sooner. And you have other populations like the Incans that lived in the Andes Mountains, and there are some advanced agricultural techniques, such as in the Andes Mountains, they had terrace farming, they had roads and bridges, that again, all of these things are being done without any modern equipment. If you've seen photos of terrace farming, it's essentially what looks like steps carved into the side of a mountain. So each one of these steps is like the size of a farm field, and it allows for farming to be done in the mountains. That is all done by hand. That is amazing. And an extensive system of roads and bridges. Look at the modern world. We have, jokingly speaking, but we have roads that are not well cared for with modern equipment. And in this time period, you had roads and bridges being built in the mountains by hand by these indigenous societies. So these are very, very advanced people in many ways, and it is often not accurately depicted that way, particularly in pop culture. It is usually depicted that they are very backward and the Europeans are bringing a better way of life to them. And that is not necessarily true in many, many ways. Now, what are we most familiar with as far as indigenous history in New York State, or even more specifically in central New York, is the Iroquois. The Iroquois lived in not only New York State, but parts of Pennsylvania as well. And this is, of course, prior to European colonization. So what we are familiar with today is the Six Nations as they are established in 1720 via this map. We are obviously most attuned to the history of the Onondaga people because we are Lafayette Central Schools, and Lafayette Central Schools includes the Onondaga Reservation. And so this is something I want you to pause and appreciate, that there are students in other parts of the state and certainly other parts of the country who do not have an enriching experience of learning what you learn in Lafayette Central Schools. Even more so if you attend the Onondaga Nation School. But the conversations that we have in Lafayette Central Schools are things that feel totally foreign to people from other parts of the state and certainly other parts of the country. When I went to college at SUNY Cortland, I had classmates, or dorm mates, I guess you could call them, that asked me what to me was laughable, silly questions about, did Native Americans still live in teepees? And I'm thinking to myself, not only are you thinking like hundreds of years out of date, but you're not even thinking the correct region of the United States or colonial America or whatever you wanted to refer to it as. And so I would then have to explain to them the concept of longhouses and also the connections of things that were learned by Europeans through interactions with the leadership in the Iroquois Confederacy that were then instituted in things like the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, the Bill of Rights, documents that shape our entire system of government today, some of which are very closely connected to the leadership styles of the Iroquois Confederacy, all the way back to pre-European colonization of the Western Hemisphere. So the Iroquois Confederacy formed after many generations of war so that the Confederacy would maintain peace. There would no longer be any need for fighting. And having this confederation allowed the Iroquois to be much more effective at resisting European authority than other tribes in other parts of what we now think of as the United States that did not have that kind of confederacy and were still at war with each other. And so Europeans were able to manipulate and use against each other tribes, whereas the Iroquois were much stronger and able to resist because of the long-standing confederation that they were used to. When conquering couldn't be done, when manipulation couldn't be done, nations like Britain and France, with what we think of as a more advanced military just because of their technology, actually had to give up on trying to manipulate or conquer and had to seek out alliances with the various tribes of the Iroquois because they were unable to follow their playbook of how to manipulate or conquer tribes as they had in other parts of North America. So that brings us to the question of what brings Europeans to the Western Hemisphere. And there's the childlike rhymes and stories and things like that about Columbus and how he was just a scientific explorer. One lesson you're going to learn from me throughout U.S. history is a question that hopefully you will be able to answer by the time we've gone over this numerous times. What makes the world go round? Money. Money and power are two things that make the world go round. It's what motivates people. It has for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And when I say money, it doesn't always mean currency. It could mean things of value. There are many examples in global history of things that were deemed valuable prior to any such thing as currency. But to bring the focus back to why were there European explorations of the world even going on? Why were explorers like Columbus even bothering to explore? Well, in the ancient world, right up through what we refer to as the colonial period in U.S. history, trade networks in Europe, Asia, Africa were all dominated by either the Silk Roads coming over from China, from shipping out of India and out of China and Southeast Asia, and through trading on the Mediterranean. Now, in order to get to India and China and get goods from there, Europeans had long since had relationships trading on the Mediterranean, but it is much more difficult to have trade relations with India and China because you are either traveling along the Silk Roads or you are traveling around Africa, because back then there is no Suez Canal on the Red Sea. And so instead of going directly through the way you would in the modern world with modern shipping vessels, you either had to go across the Silk Roads or around Africa. That is a very daunting task, and oftentimes instead of that task, the Europeans were trading with people in the Middle East. And they often thought of these Middle Easterners as middlemen, driving up their prices. So again, I'll connect it back to what motivates people. What makes the world go round? Money and power. And so explorers like Columbus, and there were others, he just happens to be the one that gets a lot of attention, they decided we are going to try to explore by going directly west and trying to find a sea route to India and China. So this is all about money and saving money and cutting out these Muslim-controlled Middle Eastern countries that they thought of as middlemen driving up their prices. Well, when Columbus supposedly discovers the New World, it's more realistic that he stupidly thought he had found India. He was actually lost in the Caribbean, and anyway, the inaccurate term Indian is attached to the indigenous populations of the Americas because Columbus was a moron and thought he had found India. And when he did supposedly discover the New World, even though he's lost, he noticed the vast natural resources, especially precious metals like gold. And so when he visits back to Spain and shows off what he discovered in the New World, Spain sends back entire armies to conquer. So picture pop culture, picture Star Wars, picture the Death Star, picture the Empire and mass slaughter. That's the Spanish conquest of the New World. And it is devastating for multiple reasons. One, you can see here the military conquest and the colorations of what empires were being overthrown militarily and controlled by Spain. But even more devastating was disease. Europeans had long since been in contact with other societies in Asia and Africa. They had not been in contact prior to the supposed discovery of the New World. And so the diseases that Europeans were bringing with them were absolutely devastating to the Native American populations of North and South America. And in particular, smallpox. Smallpox wiped out what one historian, Charles Mann, he wrote a book called 1491, The Americas Before Columbus. He also then wrote a book following that one called 1493, The Impact of Columbus and European Colonization. 1491 is fascinating because it talks about a lot of those advancements we were talking about before, such as mound builders. He talks a lot about the Amazon rainforest being a very carefully managed. We think of it as a natural phenomenon. However, the Amazon rainforest was actually a very carefully managed ecosystem by that indigenous population. So Charles Mann's writing are very fascinating. And he talks about, in 1491 and in 1493, these books, about the devastating impact of disease and how upwards of 95 to 97% of the native population in the Western Hemisphere died from these diseases. Not from war, not from conquering, from disease. And a lot of the population estimates are inaccurate in Mann's opinion. Some people referred to the population of North America, for example, as numbering in the maybe hundreds of thousands, and Mann said that based on recovered human remains from societies that had been decimated by disease like smallpox, and the therefore total population that can be calculated based on the fact that, well, here's who died, and if that is only a portion, so let's say 95% of people died, well, what about the other 5% who lived? So people were often considering the 5% who lived and basing estimates off of that, well, man said, well, no, wait a minute. Human remains tell us that there was actually a whole lot more people. And so through his research, he realized that indigenous populations were not only super advanced, but also much larger than previously thought by historians prior to modern anthropological studies of the period. So besides the Spanish Empire, I'll go back and show you that map for a moment. Besides the Spanish Empire, you also had the French and the Dutch starting to settle largely the Great Lakes region in the upper parts of this map. And you can see that here. New France and New Netherlands. The Dutch settled what is today New Jersey and the Hudson River Valley, mostly. And you had the French settling large portions of the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Great Lakes region. And when I say settling, I do not mean permanent societies. Neither of these countries were all that interested in establishing permanent societies, but rather profiting from, again, money makes the world go round, money motivates people, participating in the fur trade. And the fur trade for both of these nations was extremely lucrative, and hence where they decided to settle. As a matter of fact, the seal of New Netherlands has a beaver on it from the fur trade and how lucrative it was for them. As I said before, there are no attached questions to this lecture, but I think that some of these time periods and misrepresentations have to be clarified before you can have a proper study of American history. And so although the Regents exam doesn't often ask a lot from these time periods, and if they do, it's oversimplified, I know that you don't have any questions associated with this, but I hope nonetheless that you feel like you've learned a lot from this presentation. If you have any questions on this, don't hesitate to reach out in class.